26 police officers have been injured during an anti-immigration rally organised by the far right in London, 4 of them seriously. Police say many people came to the protest intent on violence, and the 25 arrests made so far are just the start. More than 100,000 people took part in the so-called Unite the Kingdom march. The rally was organised by far-right activist Tommy Robinson. Rhys Durham reports on the protests in central London.
People have turned out in their thousands here, tens of thousands today, in what could be one of the biggest far-right demonstrations the UK has seen for decades. They're here to see their hero, Tommy Robinson, who's appearing at a rally like this for the first time since he was released from prison for breaching a court order telling him not to repeat lies about a Syrian refugee. It's being called the Unite the Kingdom protest. And Tommy Robinson went on X last night to tell people to come out and exercise their right to free speech, to come and talk about their anger and not be afraid to say what they think of the government's asylum and immigration policies. He invoked the death of Charlie Kirk, the US far-right activist who was killed, to get people to come down here to bolster the numbers, and it appears to have worked.
Things have got to change. Mr. Starmer said a year ago when he got into power, he wants change. We want change for the better, not for the worse. We want free speech back. We want our country back.
People are sick of it. Everyone's got their own reasons why they're here. You know, this sense of just everyone hates everyone, it's just ridiculous, you know. Everyone has their own opinions on why the government are doing bad things.
Around 1,000 police officers were deployed to oversee this protest and the counter-protest organised by Stand Up to Racism happening on the other side of the divide. The two groups are separated by what the police call the sterile zone, which some Unite the Kingdom protesters did try and enter and throw projectiles at the police. Overall, though, a successful day for Tommy Robinson and his fans, with over 100,000 of them attending on this side and just 5,000 people attending the counter-demo in London. Rhys Durham.
Well, Jennifer Nadel is a UK political commentator. She says populist politicians and commentators on both sides of the Atlantic are fueling the rise of far-right sentiment in the UK.
We know that roughly 73% of Britons, when polled, are concerned about the rise of the far right. Nevertheless, it is a worrying trend and part of a very worrying rise in the far right in the UK and across Europe, of course. And in the wake of the Charlie Kirk murder, we are only expecting that to get worse. There's no doubt whatsoever that this is inflamed by those in America who have been pushing populism, and indeed Steve Bannon was billed as a speaker at this march.
Over London skyline, police vans lined up, protest banners waving. London just threw one of the biggest street parties of the year. But forget music, dancing, or flower crowns. This wasn't Glastonbury or Notting Hill Carnival. No. This was an anti-immigration rally dressed up like a patriotic jamboree, where instead of glow sticks and beats, you got Union Jacks, chants about borders, and a whole lot of tension that could snap tighter than a stretch rubber band. More than 110,000 people flooded London's streets under the banner of Unite the Kingdom. And while that name sounds like a wholesome Disney sequel, what actually unfolded looked more like a scene straight out of a dystopian political drama. Tommy Robinson, yep, the far-right activist with a rap sheet longer than a CVS receipt, was front and center. Speeches were fiery, counter-protests clashed, police officers were injured, and arrests stacked up like unwanted Amazon packages on your doorstep. But here's the kicker. This wasn't just a one-off street scuffle. It was a reflection of something much bigger, how migration, nationalism, and fear are colliding to shape the UK's future. And we're about to break it all down into 7 brutally honest, occasionally sarcastic, and definitely eye-opening facts you need to know. So buckle up, because this isn't just the news, it's global pulse news. Let's go. Let's start with the most obvious jaw-dropper. The size of the crowd. Reports say over 110,000 people turned up in London to march under the banner of Unite the Kingdom. Some outlets even pushed the number closer to 150,000. And honestly, when you look at the footage, it felt like every angry Facebook uncle in Britain suddenly logged off their feed and decided to meet in real life. Now let's put that in perspective. 110,000 people is the equivalent of filling Wembley Stadium and then some. It's more than the entire population of Cambridge or Bath marching down Whitehall chanting about immigration. That's not your average weekend protest. That's a logistical beast. And for police, it was a nightmare. The Metropolitan Police set up sterile areas designed to keep protesters and counter-protesters apart. Sounds clinical, right? Like they were prepping for surgery instead of a protest. But here's the problem. The rally was so big, so sprawling, that controlling those sterile zones was like trying to keep toddlers out of a cookie jar. You can set the rules, but eventually, somebody's going to break them. And break them they did. Now, why does crowd size matter? Because size equals influence, or at least the perception of it. A 5,000-person protest is a passionate group. A 110,000-person march is a movement, at least in optics. This is why far-right figures were gloating online afterward, bragging about turnout like it was a new Olympic record. And perception can be just as powerful as reality. Because the headlines don't say, tiny rally in a side street. They say, massive protest rocks London. But here's where it gets even juicier. Many analysts didn't expect the numbers to swell this high. Previous far-right marches in the UK often drew in the low thousands. To jump from a couple thousand to well over 100,000, that's not just a bump, that's a political growth spurt. And whether you agree with them or not, that kind of escalation sends shockwaves through the political landscape. Add to this the fact that counter-protesters also showed up, we'll get to them later, and suddenly London became less city of history and more battlefield of narratives. Because remember, when you have a crowd this big, it's no longer about a few angry individuals. It's about the image of a nation divided played out live on your newsfeed. And if you think that sheer size was shocking enough, wait until you hear what the folks behind the microphones were saying, because the speeches took this rally from big to downright explosive. Now, if the sheer size of the crowd set the stage, the speeches were the soundtrack. And boy, was it a greatest hits album of fear, nationalism, and conspiracy. Leading the lineup was none other than Tommy Robinson, whose real name, fun fact, is Stephen Yaxley Lennon. Yes, because nothing screams man of the people like hiding behind a stage name that sounds like a discount action figure. Robinson was joined by other far-right heavyweights, including French polemicist Éric Zemmour, who has practically turned xenophobia into performance art. And just when you thought the speakers list couldn't get any spicier, a surprise video message appeared from, you guessed it, Elon Musk. Because apparently, running Tesla, SpaceX, and a social media platform into chaos isn't enough. Now he's guest starring in far-right political rallies. Someone called Netflix. This crossover episode writes itself. So, what exactly did they say? Robinson framed immigration as a threat to Britain's identity, claiming that migrants have more rights than the people who built the country. That's the kind of line that sounds powerful in a chant, but collapses under about 2 seconds of fact-checking. Zemmour added his own continental flavor, warning of civilizational decline, and Musk, never one to underperform on controversy, talked about the dangers of uncontrolled migration. Sprinkle in references to the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, you know, the unfounded belief that immigration is a secret plot to replace white Europeans, and suddenly the rally wasn't just about immigration policy. It was about framing migration as an existential war. Here's why this matters. Language shapes movements. When influential figures use apocalyptic rhetoric, they don't just fire up the base, they move the Overton window, shifting what's considered mainstream political conversation. A few years ago, the Great Replacement was something relegated to the darker corners of the internet. Now it's being discussed at rallies with 6-figure attendances, streamed online, amplified by celebrities turned billionaire tech lords. And the contradictions? They were almost comedic. Robinson, who spent time in prison for contempt of court after making false accusations about a Syrian refugee, stood on stage preaching about truth and freedom of speech. That's like a chef banned from kitchens lecturing people about food safety. The crowd ate it up, though. Chants, cheers, flags waving. It felt less like a protest and more like a rally concert, except instead of Taylor Swift lyrics, people were chanting about borders and patriotism, which, let's face it, doesn't really slap as a Spotify playlist. Big crowd, fiery words, what could possibly go wrong? Spoiler alert, plenty. Because when words turned into action, the streets of London went from debate to chaos in record time. Here's where the peaceful protest storyline takes a hard left into the territory of smashed glass, flying bottles, and police officers nursing bruises. The Metropolitan Police reported that 26 officers were injured, with at least 4 seriously hurt. Imagine going to work thinking you'll be directing traffic and instead getting smacked with a projectile? Not exactly the kind of overtime anyone signs up for. At least 25 people were arrested, facing charges ranging from assaulting officers to violent disorder and criminal damage. And the footage? Brutal. Bottles arcing through the air, police lines pushed back, chants morphing into shoves, then punches. It wasn't just shouting anymore. It was London on the brink of a street brawl. So how did it escalate? According to police, protesters broke into sterile areas that had been set up to keep groups apart. Once those barriers fell, chaos spread faster than a rumor in a high school cafeteria. Officers had to intervene in multiple locations as demonstrators tried to breach cordons and confront counterprotesters. The words, "wholly unacceptable," came straight from Assistant Commissioner Matt Twist, who sounded less like a police official and more like a fed-up dad who just walked into a living room full of broken furniture. But here's the kicker. Not everyone came with violence on their minds. Police acknowledged that many attended to protest peacefully. It was a subset, the ones fueled by anger and opportunity, that ignited the clashes. And yet, once the images hit the news, nuance went out the window. To the average viewer, it didn't matter whether half the marchers just wanted to wave flags quietly. What mattered was the footage of chaos, and chaos makes headlines. Now, let's zoom out. Violence at protests isn't new. From Paris to Portland, whenever crowds swell, the odds of confrontation skyrocket. But in the UK context, this was a stark reminder of how fragile that line is between protest and disorder. One breach, one spark, and suddenly a political rally looks more like a riot scene from Peaky Blinders. And the optics? Damaging. Nothing undermines a law and order message quite like your own supporters throwing bottles at cops. It's like showing up to a wedding in a tuxedo, then flipping the cake table. Whatever point you wanted to make, it gets lost in the mess. So we've got size, we've got fiery speeches, and now we've got violence. But this wasn't a one-sided spectacle, because across London, another crowd had something to say, and their message was the polar opposite. If the far right had the numbers, the flags, and the megaphones, the other side of the street had something just as important: principle and visibility. Enter the counterprotest. Organized by groups like Stand Up to Racism, this gathering pulled in around 5,000 people. Now, compared to 110,000, that might sound like a David versus Goliath situation. But as history tells us, David had a pretty good aim. The counter-protesters were loud, proud, and relentless. Their chants cut through the noise. No justice, no peace, no fascists on our streets, and this is what community looks like. And that last one, honestly, it was the perfect clapback. Because while the far-right crowd was talking about borders and divisions, this group was literally embodying diversity. People of all races, religions, genders, and political backgrounds standing shoulder to shoulder. Now, this wasn't just an angry mob in reverse. Politicians like John McDonnell and Diane Abbott actually showed up to speak. That's significant because when elected officials stand at a counter-protest, they're not just opposing a march, they're signaling that what's happening on the other side threatens not just social harmony, but the core values of the nation. And in this case, they framed the far-right protest as a rejection of British values rather than an expression of them. Journalists on the ground like Sangeeta Maiska noted the diversity of the counter-protest, emphasizing that people of all political persuasions, class, race, gender, and ability were present. That's the kind of mosaic that directly undermines Robinson's narrative that immigration and multiculturalism are tearing the country apart. Because when you literally see different communities uniting peacefully against hate, the argument that immigrants divide us doesn't hold much water. Here's the bigger picture. Counter-protests aren't just about optics. They're about morale. When marginalized groups see people showing up for them, it sends a message louder than any speech that they are not alone. In moments like these, numbers don't tell the whole story. 10,000 people shouting, "Close the borders," can feel intimidating. But 5,000 chanting, "Refugees, welcome," can remind the nation that compassion still has a voice. And let's be real, the visual contrast was striking. On one side, flags, nationalistic chants, and a sprinkling of violent confrontations. On the other, handmade signs, rainbow flags, and chants of solidarity. If this were a movie, the symbolism would be so on the nose it'd almost be cheesy. Yet, in real life, it was powerful. But while one side was singing about unity and justice, the other side was waving symbols like they were collectible Pokemon cards. And the irony of those symbols? Oh, it's rich. Let's talk flags, food, and contradictions that deserve their own comedy sketch. Okay. Let's talk props. Because this rally wasn't just about speeches and shouting, it was a sea of symbols. Union Jacks everywhere, the red and white St. George's Cross fluttering proudly, a scattering of American flags, Israeli flags, even the occasional MAGA hat tossed in for extra chaos. Honestly, if you looked fast enough, you'd think you'd stumbled into a clearance sale at a flag shop. Now, symbols matter. Flags carry history, pride, and identity. But here's the kicker. The way they were used here turned them into something else entirely. For many protesters, the Union Jack and St. George's Cross weren't just patriotic emblems, they were rebranded as exclusionary banners, a kind of members-only pass for who they think deserves to belong in Britain. That's why Prime Minister Keir Starmer later emphasized that the flag belongs to everyone, not just those who wield it as a tool of division. Because when extremists monopolize a symbol, the symbol itself gets tainted. But wait, it gets better. The irony was on full display when videos emerged of protesters scarfing down, you guessed it, Indian food, samosas, pakoras, naan, biryani, the whole delicious spread. Imagine chanting, "Send them home," with one hand, while dunking up pakora in chutney with the other. It's like demanding a wall while standing in line at Taco Bell. You can't make this stuff up. And the contradictions don't stop there. Some marchers waved Israeli flags in a rally that also featured people pushing anti-Muslim rhetoric. Others wore American MAGA hats at a protest about British immigration policy. The mishmash of symbols looked less like a united movement and more like a cultural buffet where no one checked if the dishes actually went together. But here's the serious side. Symbolism is powerful because it works on an emotional level. A flag doesn't need a speech. It instantly communicates belonging or exclusion. That's why seeing the St. George's Cross at a football match feels unifying. But seeing it at a rally chanting about deportations feels divisive. The same cloth, completely different meaning, depending on who's holding it. And maybe that's the greatest irony of all. While one side of the rally weaponized flags to divide, the counter-protest weaponized diversity to unite. One side held up centuries-old symbols of nationalism. The other side held up handmade posters saying, "This is what community looks like." And when those images hit TV and social media, the contrast practically narrated itself. So we've seen the counter-narrative, the flags, the contradictions, and you're probably wondering, what did the political class have to say about all this? Well, let's just say Britain's leaders were not exactly sitting this one out.
If the protests were the fire, the political fallout was the smoke. And you could see it rising over Westminster almost immediately. Because when 110,000 people flood central London chanting about borders and clashing with police, politicians don't get to sip tea quietly in the background. They're forced to pick a side, take a stand, and, let's be honest, spin it all for maximum political mileage. Prime Minister Keir Starmer was quick to respond, striking a balance between defending the right to protest and condemning the violence. He said Britain would never surrender its flag to extremists using it as a weapon of division. Translation: you can wave your Union Jack all you want, but don't act like you're the sole shareholder of British identity. This was a clear attempt to reclaim patriotism from the far right, a reminder that being proud of your country doesn't mean turning it into a fortress. Then there's Home Secretary Shabana Mahmood, who promised that the 25 arrested and anyone else identified on camera would face robust legal action. It's a polite British way of saying, we're coming for you, and no, you can't pay the fine with Tesco Club card points. Assistant Commissioner Matt Twist echoed the line, calling the attacks on officers wholly unacceptable, because nothing undermines a movement faster than your supporters pelting the very people tasked with keeping the peace. But the real curveball came from Elon Musk's cameo video message, which quickly sparked calls for the government to reconsider business contracts with his companies. Imagine running a car company and somehow managing to get your name dropped in a London street brawl. Only Musk could turn a political rally into a branding crisis. Some MPs blasted him for stoking the fire. Others argued that silencing his speech would be a slippery slope. Either way, Musk managed to stay on brand, unpredictable, controversial, and impossible to ignore. Critics also worried about the normalization of far-right rhetoric. If speeches about replacement theories and civilizational decline are being blasted in front of six-figure crowds, what does that do to the mainstream discourse? Leaders across Europe are watching closely, because once language like that takes root in public debate, it's like spilling red wine on white carpet. You're not scrubbing it out easily. And of course, opposition MPs and activists seized the moment. Diane Abbott, John McDonnell, and others framed the protest as proof that Britain is facing not just an immigration challenge, but a democratic one. Whether the country will define itself by fear and exclusion, or by inclusivity and resilience. That's not just spin, it's a fight for the nation's story. Which brings us to the million-pound question. Is this just a one-off spark of chaos, or the beginning of something much bigger? Let's zoom out and see why these protests feel less like noise and more like a seismic shift. Here's where we stop zooming in on bottles, flags, and sound bites, and zoom out to the wider canvas. Because what happened in London wasn't an isolated Saturday tantrum. It was part of a bigger story unfolding across the UK and, honestly, across much of Europe and the West. First, the obvious. This wasn't the first anti-immigration protest of 2025. Earlier in the year, we saw similar rallies in towns like Bristol, Manchester, and Epping. Some fizzled out quietly, others ended in scuffles. But London's turnout was different. It wasn't just bigger, it was record-breaking. That suggests a momentum shift. A crowd this size doesn't appear overnight. It's the product of months, even years of frustration, online organizing, and rhetoric finding fertile ground. Second, the normalization factor. A decade ago, if you'd heard the words "great replacement theory" in British politics, it would have sounded like fringe internet conspiracy nonsense. Today, it's being repeated at a rally in front of 100,000 people, with a billionaire tech mogul chiming in via video message. That's how fringe ideas seep into mainstream conversation. Repetition, amplification, normalization. What was once taboo gets repeated enough that it becomes just another viewpoint. And that's where the danger lies, because normalized extremism doesn't look extreme anymore. Third, the global echo. Across Europe, far-right parties are gaining traction by hammering on migration. From Marine Le Pen in France to Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, the playbook is the same. Frame immigration as an existential threat, then promise to save the nation. The UK's Unite the Kingdom rally fits into this pattern. And when crowds this size show up, international far-right movements take notice. These protests become both a template and a morale boost. And finally, the political stakes. Immigration is no longer a side debate. It's becoming the debate. Forget healthcare, forget housing. Political discourse is increasingly orbiting around borders and identity. And when the central political axis shifts like that, elections, party platforms, and even public trust in institutions can shift with it. London's protest might be a snapshot, but it's also a preview of where the national conversation is heading. So no, this wasn't just noise. This was a drumbeat, loud, aggressive, and likely to keep playing until someone either drowns it out with a different tune or decides to dance to it.